Good. Howdy.
Hey,
So, again, so Abraham is going to take us. The Abraham story is going to take us three meetings, just because uh, we're going to do the Hagar part separately, simply because she disrupts the. I mean, we're following the God Abraham relationship, and and in her episode with Sarah and Ishmael, and Ishmael's genealogy is. I mean, it's part of the story, but it just doesn't follow. So we're gonna continue what we've been doing, and then next week kind of revisit the Hagar story and continue on with Isaac, or I guess Isaac and Jacob. Um, so so in the first five conversations between Abraham and God, the repeated theme is Abraham's doubt in God's promise. You know, he doesn't trust God's providence and protection in the Egypt episode. He asks for a miracle. He complains to God that God hasn't been true to his word in terms of seed, in terms of a son. Um, and God responds by repromising and offering miracles and telling Abraham, if you remember after the War of the Four Kings, to stop being afraid. You know, trust me, trust my promise, trust my providence and protection. Don't be afraid. And so now now we're at the Avimelech episode in Genesis 20, which is a seemingly exact repeat of Abraham's shameful conduct in Egypt. Okay, so it looks like two repeating stories, and just like we saw with the two repeating creation stories. Only here, they're exact replays. So as you can imagine, the documentary hypothesists have a field day, or biblical critics, biblical criticism people. Um, you know, they have a field day with these two stories about Abraham visiting a foreign kingdom, Egypt there, Gerar here, claiming that Sarah is his sister out of fear that the king will take her by force and kill him. The king takes her in, and then the king has to return her to Abraham in shame because of some sort of punishment, divine punishment for this sin of taking another man's wife. Um, so, to biblical criticism scholars, these are the same stories, the same story, just reflecting a different tradition about the where and what. Okay, where did this happen? And also the second story is more clear about Sarah's chastity. Okay, in Egypt, we're just extrapolating that Pharaoh didn't touch her. Here it is clarified. So either these are different traditions about where this shameful episode happened. Some Israelites thought it was in Egypt, others thought it was in Gerar. And another explanation is that this is just a retelling in a way that later traditions tried to present Sarah as beyond reproach, as pure. Um, and of course, as biblical criticism often has it, that you have these two different traditions, two different tellings, and our clumsy biblical editor just couldn't find a way to unite them, and so he just threw them both in. Okay? And again, like we said at the very beginning, to believe this, we'd have to ignore the meaningful dissimilarities between the two stories, and also ignore the fact that Abraham had overall seven conversations with God, advancing their relationship, including these two episodes. Okay? God talks to him after Egypt. God talks to him again after Gerar. Okay, so you'd have to ignore the 7 conversations. The meaningfulness of the number 7, and you'd have to miss the fact that these 7 separate conversations with God are 7 separate stages in Abraham's gradual transformation, or in the development of the relationship. So we know how the documentary hypothesis will explain this. Our method, as we've established, is to read the text as if it's high literature and things are there on purpose, rather than just by clumsily dumping different oral traditions together. So, as we read it, let's focus not just on the similarities of the two stories, but also on the dissimilarities. Okay? So when you compare this episode to the previous time that Abraham pulled this trick, this clever ruse in Egypt, what are the differences?
So in the first episode, it was Pharaoh's servants or men or something who noticed Sarai's beauty, and in the Avimelech episode, it is Avimelech himself, who noticed Sarai's beauty.
Yeah, that's true.
And then another big difference is in the Avimelech story, he hears he gets offended that Abraham would even think of doing this, whereas Pharaoh, we never see anything like that.
That's true. Yeah. It's Abraham is kind of chastised both by God and Avimelech, whereas you're right.
In the Pharaoh story, he's just he's scared. He's not morally enraged. And then what you mentioned about it's more clear in the second story that Sarai didn't consummate anything with Avimelech.
Right. Yeah. There's no, like, again, in Egypt, you could question it. You could wonder. Here, impossible. Yeah.
And then it is strange because it does seem shameful in the first episode. And in this episode, it seems even more shameful because it seems like it wasn't even necessary.
Why not?
It seems like if perhaps Abraham and Sarah were in real danger in Egypt, and he played it exactly the only way he could play it. Whereas in Avimelech, if he would have been up front in the beginning, it could have gone differently because Avimelech is a different kind of person than Pharaoh.
Why do you say? I mean,
just because of his indignation. He was because of his criticism of Abraham for not telling him in the first place that he's Chet. Like he finds it. I guess you have to. Is he just putting on a show or not? But if he does, is he really indignant?
Yeah.
That Abraham would try to pull this on.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And so he would think of himself as being a more decent person, perhaps, than Pharaoh.
Yeah. There's also when Pharaoh and Avimelech find out what's going on, there's a difference there too, in terms of what happens after Abraham is discovered.
There's a show of power with Pharaoh.
Right, Pharaoh gives him all these gifts and everything else, and sends him on his way. Get out of here. Okay. How about with Avimelech?
It wasn't. I'm blanking now. It wasn't gifts. There's the well episode.
No, but no, the wells you mean with Isaac.
Let's see, it's later.
Yeah, that's a later story. I mean, again, actually, it's a good thing to keep in mind that we will have a third retelling of this story with Isaac. Isaac will will pull the same brilliant move as his father. But yeah, we'll leave that for later. In Grar with Avimelech again. But when God tells Avimelech what's going on, so with Pharaoh, when he finds out, he just, okay, take her back, go, and everything's done. But when God reveals to Avimelech what's going on, why his family is his not castle, his palace. His palace is cursed, and why they're suffering so. He tells him this is what's going on, and he tells Avimelech to return Sarah to her husband and to ask Abraham to pray for him, so that he and his people will heal and not die. Remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So in Egypt, all Pharaoh had to do was to get his hands off Sarah and leave Sarah to Abraham for to remove God's punishment. Here, Avimelech has to ask Abraham to pray for him. So it's not just taking your hands off this taken woman already. So why does Abraham have to pray this time? And Avimelech points out to Abraham, this is in verse 20, verse 9. 20, verse 9 and 10. Okay. He calls Abraham and tells him, "What have you done to us, and what have I done to you that you brought on me and my kingdom such a grave sin, making me do things that should not be done?" Yeah. Okay. So Avimelech chastises Abraham that Abraham is the one responsible for Avimelech's sin. Okay? I didn't do this. You made me. He said that his own hands, his own heart is clean. Which, if you remember, in 5 and 6, in 4, 5, and 6, in 4 and 5, Avimelech says that he is clean. It's not his fault. He was misled about this woman, and I did it with a clean heart and clean hands. I meant nothing by it. It's not my fault, and God acknowledges it in verse 6. God says, "I know that you did it with a clean heart." Okay. So.
Yeah, Pharaoh does not.
Yeah.
Apparently, Pharaoh does not have a clean heart. They don't go into it.
Yeah, look, we know. The thing is, we know that Pharaoh also was misled. Okay, but all that God requires of Pharaoh is to not stain this woman, and that's it. The punishment's over. The punishment is lifted. Here, God knows that it's not Avimelech's fault. God knows that it's Abraham's fault. And yet, giving the woman back is not enough. He has to, Avimelech is required to ask Abraham to please pray for him. So, if God knows that Avimelech did not commit a sin in his own heart or in his hands, he didn't touch her, why does he require Abraham to pray for Avimelech? This is clearly, again, if you focus not on the similarities but focus on the differences, this was clearly inserted here as a very different element of the story So it meant something to the author. Okay, so what is it? What's it for? Who's it for? What's the purpose of making Abraham pray for Avimelech?
In the explanation, Abraham says he did it because he was frightened because he thought this was a godless land. So I guess perhaps he could be doing it to try to help Avimelech, who's a decent person in a godless land.
Actually, but I mean, and not that this is important to this issue, but it's actually a nice, like a funny element. It reminds me a little bit of Adam's response to God, where he hides, and also the woman that you gave me made me do it. Abraham here says not just I was afraid because there's no fear of God in this place and that you'll kill me, but also Sarah is my sister, because Sarah is his half sister in verse 12.
Yeah.
He says that she is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and therefore I wasn't lying, really. Okay, so he's I wasn't really lying. She really is my half sister, also my wife, which I didn't tell you. But that's just kind of comic relief. So again, but why is it important? Look, it's clearly important for God that Abraham pray for Avimelech, to lift this curse from Avimelech. So, like, why is it important to God? Well, like, what's the function of this element that's inserted here about praying for this fella?
My interpretation is that he's a decent human being in a rough land, and we've seen this before.
He meaning Avimelech or Abraham?
No, Avimelech is a decent person in a godless land, and is not a part of the new way. Is not a part of the covenant. Is not a part of the protection of God. Is outside of that.
Yeah, but look, the same is true of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is also not under the protection, and all that Pharaoh needs to do is not commit a sin, or not continue committing the sin of holding this woman, and the curse is lifted. And God tells us and tells Avimelech, I know you did it with a clean heart. I know that you didn't commit something bad out of wickedness. I mean, if God knows this, then why is he continuing to punish Avimelech after Avimelech returns the woman? Like,
is it punished, or what? Why is it punishment?
Oh, because for the curse to be removed, Abraham has to pray for him. It's not enough to just give Sarah back.
But was the curse a punishment by the biblical God, or was the curse something that came from without? Because he's a Philistine, right? He's from the land of Philistine.
No, they're not Philistines. It's like the desert people to the south of what became Judea. But oh, sorry. Wait. Yeah. So look in verse 7,
Mhm.
and now return the woman, the wife, and he will pray for you, so that you would live. And if you don't do it, know that you shall die, and everyone and your household shall die. Okay.
So That being a threat that if you either do this or else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, but again, in order to remove this punishment, you have to get Abraham to pray for you. Okay? So my question is, who is the prayer, like, what's this meant to accomplish? Because look, God already knows that Avimelech did not do anything worthy of a death sentence.
So it'd be for the benefit of Abraham, I guess.
That's the way it seems to me. Okay, it's clearly not for the benefit of Avimelech. God could treat Avimelech if God wanted. If this was simply a matter of right and wrong vis-a-vis God, God could treat Avimelech the same way he treated Pharaoh. In fact, Avimelech is cleaner than Pharaoh. Okay. So I think, look, I don't know either, but I come to the same conclusion as you, that it seems to me that this is an education for Abraham, not for Avimelech. Okay. Look, Abraham does not know everything that God has done or has threatened Avimelech and his family and his people, okay, because of what Abraham had done. Okay, so this way, by telling Avimelech to confront Abraham and ask him to pray for him, this is a way to make Abraham come face to face with the fact that he has made another man sin. Okay, to come face to face with the fact that Abraham's fear, his faithlessness in God's commitment and God's protection, has put an innocent man plus all of his household in mortal danger. So, look, it looks like that God wants to rub Abraham's nose in it like a dog. Like when your dog goes on the carpet. See what you did? See what you did? This is what, you did this. You're being punished for this. So.
Then why didn't he punish him with Pharaoh?
Pardon?
Or why is it different with Pharaoh?
Well, look, this is the difference, okay, between the two stories. Okay? In the first one, God simply spoke with Abraham afterwards and repeats the promise and kind of, basically implies to us, I saw what you did, stop being afraid. I'm protecting you. Okay? Don't give the woman that I told you would be the vessel for your seed, don't give it to another man. Okay? But he walks away without this kind of, Pharaoh doesn't confront him. He doesn't have to do anything. Abraham doesn't have to do anything. So why is it, why here?
And I always, in my mind, this is from probably commentaries I've read, but Avimelech reminds me of Melchizedek,
mm-hmm.
the
king of Jerusalem,
the priest of God Most High from earlier on in Genesis 14.
Uh-huh.
So you have, and he's not of the new, he's not of Israel. It's not of the new way that comes through Abraham or anything like that.
No, nobody's from Israel. No.
Right. So so you have these decent people that aren't Abraham that live in this, these chaotic lands, that being Melchizedek and Avimelech. Mm-hmm. Like, even though they live without law, they're still decent human beings.
Yeah. Well, look, even Abraham doesn't live with law. I mean, the law hasn't been given yet. The law will be given 400 years from now after the Exodus.
Right. There's a covenant, I guess. But
yeah, but I mean, there's, other than the circumcision, there's no law. There's no kosher or purity laws or anything. Abraham just lives his life. But okay, so they're good people here.
Whereas I distinguish in my mind Pharaoh. Like, Pharaoh is never presented as.
Yeah, but look, but we've already established that this seems like it's meant for Abraham, not for the person he's praying for. Okay?
So my question is, if the biblical God had been clear with Abraham and said, this act which you did with your wife Sarah was wrong, then it seems like he wouldn't have done, because he usually does what is explicitly asked of him. So when God is ambiguous and says, don't be afraid, does that mean he's categorically coming down on what he did in Egypt? And my own, like, it seems like it does seem like a shameful act to me.
Oh,
but the biblical God doesn't, it feels like it's coming from me.
Are you frozen?
Can you hear me?
Oh, I couldn't hear you. You said it seems like it's coming from, and then
it seems like a shameful act, but it seems like I'm reading, like I'm putting my shame in what I think is a shameful act into it. It seems still, it doesn't seem unequivocal that the biblical God unequivocally says, don't be afraid, I'm with you, but doesn't pass judgment on what Abraham did in Egypt, whereas he does seem to pass more judgment, like he's more involved in the second story.
Right, yeah, it's more explicit. Well, look, it's explicit in the sense that in Egypt, that this is a married woman. Okay, that Pharaoh is committing something grave, as it is here with Avimer. But you're right that look, here you have, because of God's instruction to Avimelech, then Abraham is confronted by Avimelech, saying, what have you done to me? You have done a terrible thing to me, etc., etc., which in Egypt, that scene was never kind of orchestrated by God, because all Pharaoh had to do was leave Sarah and all was lifted and forgiven.
Are we highlighting that Abraham seems to be treating everybody the same, all these strangers, as being people who are out to get him and going to do terrible things, so he's forced into this strange situation?
Yeah, look, Abraham is afraid. Like, we know that Abraham is afraid because Abraham clarified that is the case. Like, he told us when he had that conversation with Sarah, I'm afraid he'll kill me. He says here the same thing, I was afraid. Okay? And God told him, don't be afraid. I think, to your point, Abraham is not improving. Okay, we've had now a number of stages since the Egyptian episode, and Abraham is not improving in either courage or faith in God's promise, protection, etc. And God aims, like this whole story is about God and Abraham developing trust or faith in one another. Most important for us, Abraham developing faith, trust in God's alliance. That God is with him, that God isn't some voice in his head, that God is true to his word despite the evidence of the contrary. Again, Abraham still doesn't have a son. Okay, so God aims to make Abraham believe in him and trust him, and to make Abraham worthy of this alliance with God, of becoming God's chosen man and the father of God's chosen people. And so, again, it seems to me that making Abraham pray for this man is a way to make Abraham confront in a way that obviously Abraham didn't do in Egypt, because he's repeating it. Again, just like with your dog. The fact that the dog went again on the carpet means that what you did to him last time, again, shouting at him or whatever, didn't do the trick. He didn't learn. And so now you're doing it more forcefully. Okay.
But it's strange that it happens again with Isaac. If the biblical God just came out and said, this is wrong, don't do this, it seems like you wouldn't have the second and third episode.
Look, you're right that everything that God tells Abraham to do, he does. Okay, but look, he doesn't. Clearly, God wants Abraham to simply know, or to simply have faith in him, not because I told you to. Look, God told Abraham to leave his father's house. God told Abraham to do this and this and that, and he does it. Everything, circumcise yourself, etc. He wants Abraham to, and yet Abraham does these things, but we've seen, and we'll see, Abraham doesn't trust God's word.
So if we go back before Egypt, what caused him to go down to Egypt was the famine in the land. And he could have stayed there and just, but he tried to anticipate, hey, if I stay here much longer, me and all these people with me are going to die of hunger.
Yeah.
And so now I'm not going to trust that God's going to take care of me here. I'm going to go down to Egypt,
right, which
starts that. And then when he's down in Egypt, he's trying to think ahead. Look, if I'm going to survive here with all these people, I need to do something because this Pharaoh is going to kill me if I don't, because of my beautiful wife. And so he concocts this way of trying to get around it. So is the criticism that he didn't just trust in God in the first place, and all the way up to where the knife was at the throat, there's no turning back? Like if he would have stayed in the land much longer and God didn't come through, he and all his people would die.
Yeah, look, it seems to me that leaving Canaan is equivalent to pretending that he's Sarah's brother. Yeah, because look, God brought him to this land.
He's hedging if God doesn't come through.
Yeah, he basically said, look, I'm not, this voice, and again, we've seen that Abraham, he keeps asking, is this voice in my head really God? He wants a sign, he wants a miracle, and then and God steps it up. It was a voice, now it's also a vision. Now it's also these miracles in the covenant of the pieces, okay? And God promises, re-promises and re-promises, and eventually He'll give him the ultimate miracle. Okay? But God is aware of the fact, because Abraham shows it and says it outright, I don't trust you. God says.
But has God done anything thus far?
How can I know that this is true? Abraham says.
But so Abraham goes along with it, it seems, until like lives are at stake, like with the famine or with Egypt.
Right. Whenever Abraham is afraid for his life, okay, going to Egypt, going to Canaan, it's crazy, but it's not a death sentence in his mind. But going to Egypt with this beautiful woman, or maybe facing starvation in Canaan, that's a death sentence.
Right.
Being killed by Pharaoh, being killed by Avimer, that's a death sentence. But it basically, when push comes to shove, God sees, Abraham knows that he doesn't trust God's word. Okay, and so go ahead.
If he was following God from his homeland, into this wilderness, into Canaan, and then he finds himself where he's faced with a situation, I'm going to die of starvation, and all these people with me, my family, everyone with me, are going to die unless I go to Egypt, and this is the last possible thing I can do. And he pulls up and goes to Egypt, and God hasn't provided for him in the first place. Like, isn't that a reason to question the biblical God? That he gets pushed to, like, he keeps on getting, his life keeps on being put in danger over and over and over again after he leaves his homeland.
No, exactly. Look, we understand when God first spoke to Abraham, we already established it's insane. Yeah. It's insane to believe this voice in your head. And even after you've come to believe that this God really is some sort of divine force, to believe that this is the ultimate divine force who has the power to do all these things, including to make my barren wife not barren. Okay? So look, you're now explaining correctly as far as we're concerned, as far as Abraham is concerned, why Abraham is afraid. Okay? Because he doesn't believe that God is the real deal. He doesn't trust that God will protect and provide for him as God has promised. And how can he believe it? Okay? Because after all, God did not fulfill his main promise of seed. Well, early on, he doesn't even provide his promise of wealth and land. He comes back from Egypt, okay, now Abraham has wealth. After the War of the Four Kings, okay, now he has land. But even now, with Avimer, he still hasn't lived up to his real promise. That's what really Abraham gave up. And again, this isn't us kind of reading psychologically the subtext in Abraham. We know that this is gnawing at Abraham because we heard him complain to God explicitly about this, about the fact that you have given me no seed. And how can I know that this is, he needs a sign. Okay? And so, like you said, Abraham sees daily evidence in his barren wife that God is not a man of his word. Okay? And so if that's the case, then how can Abraham ever overcome his fear and truly trust that God is really trustworthy on the other promises? Look, if God isn't providing me the son, which is what this whole thing was about, how can I trust that he really will come through for me when there's a drought, when there's a powerful king who wants to kill me? Okay, so this issue is that Abraham doesn't trust God, and God is trying to make Abraham believe in him. Trust me. Trust that I am with you. Trust that I know what's best for you, and I want what's best for you, and I will provide it. I will provide and protect you. Okay, so these episodes, with Pharaoh and now again with Avimer, like he clearly didn't improve. He didn't shed this fear after Egypt. And so now the humiliation for Abraham is greater because he's been confronted by Avimelech, and he has to pray to God to remove this sin from Avimelech. Okay, so it seems like, again, a method that the prayer is not for Avimelech. The prayer is for Abraham to believe in me, I will protect you. Okay? Not to mention the fact, so it's to improve Abraham, but also there's the issue of the fact that Abraham, with his clever scheming, by making Sarah's womb available to these foreign potentates, to these foreign kings, Abraham himself is threatening God's promise. God's scheme was to make Sarah's womb an incubator for Abraham's seed. And here Abraham is giving her to other men. Okay, so so partly it's to make Abraham a more faithful, or forget more, to make Abraham have faith in God. But also, if God's good scheme is going to overcome Abraham's bad schemes or cowardly schemes, then Abraham will have to be taught to overcome his fearfulness. And his fearfulness is a product of his lack of faith in God, which, as you say, is completely justified, or completely...
it just seems like so far
it's reasonable.
Put in danger over and over and over and over again.
Yeah. But again, it's kind of like when I asked you about faith. If a voice came and told you to jump off this bridge, I'll save you. The faith is tested not as you walk to the bridge, not as you get on the ledge. The faith is tested in whether you actually jump or not. That's how an observer.
He's not walking to the edge.
Exactly.
Close enough.
Yeah, look, Pharaoh didn't come to him and say, "Are you the husband?" with a knife. Same with Avimelech. He didn't stay in Canaan
until people started dying.
until he was starving. He prevented starvation by going to Egypt. Okay, so he's not, and as we'll see, the last test or the last episode, he is bringing the dagger down on Isaac's neck. Okay, that's jumping off the ledge. He really is doing it. Okay, so by that last episode, the mission has been will have been accomplished. Okay, so
but it was only.
Go ahead.
It was only after maybe an unequivocal miracle happened.
Of course, yeah.
So this is all before an unequivocal miracle has happened.
Exactly. Look, like you said, look, when I asked you what would make you believe that this is not a voice in your head, but really the real God of the universe, and you said, I'll have to have a bona fide miracle. And everything that Abraham has experienced so far is not a bona fide miracle. I remember I asked you, at what point of the story do you, as an outsider, see evidence for Abraham that this cannot be him going crazy? It can't be a delusion. It's Isaac. Okay? When Isaac is born, okay, there's no way that I'm imagining this because other people can see him. This is a real live boy. This is not a vision. I can imagine a vision. I can imagine smoke. I can imagine God walking and splitting these animals and whatever else. This boy is not a figment of my imagination. Okay? And at that point, you're right. From that point on, the transformation that God wanted has been accomplished. Okay? So let's get to that then. So finally, so finally, God's good scheme comes to pass with the birth of a son. Okay, in fact, right after this Avimelech incident, we're told at the very beginning of Genesis 21 that Sarah delivered, in verse 1 and 2. That Sarah delivered a baby boy, just as God had promised the year before. Remember when Abraham was visited by the angels before Sodom and Gomorrah?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the year before, when God came to Abraham's tent and predicted, when those angels came and predicted that a year from now we'll come back and you'll have a son, and Sarah will be holding a son. In verse 19, chapter 17, so he tells them, Abraham falls down laughing when they tell him that he'll have a son next year. So he laughs and says, a 100-year-old man will have a son with a 90-year-old woman? Hardy har. And he says, Ishmael will be, will be the one, will be my heir. And God says, no, it'll be Sarah's son, and you will name him Isaac. And it's through him that I will have this alliance with you for forever and ever. Okay. Now, Isaac, Yitzchak in Hebrew, means either, so in modern Hebrew, it's laugh in the future. He will laugh. In biblical Hebrew, it could go either way. Either he will laugh, like Yitzchak, or Vayitzchak is actually in the past. So either he will laugh or he laughed. Okay. So God tells them, you will call your son, he laughed. Okay, so the name choice, God's name choice, refers to the scene in which Abraham laughs at the promise that God will indeed give him a son at his age and at his wife's age. Okay, in verse 17. And you remember, Sarah also laughed at that prediction. This is in Genesis 18, verse 11, 12. Okay, Abraham and Sarah old. She stopped having her period, and Sarah laughed, saying that that I will have this, and my man is old. I'm an old lady. My old man is an old man. And so again, she laughs at this idea. Okay, so Abraham laughs, Sarah laughs, and now God says, your son will be called, he laughed. And again, so again, the laughter is again Abraham not having faith, not believing that God will come through. Okay, and Abraham's, like we just said, Abraham's been in doubt about this God fellow since the very first conversation they had, and through the last one, with the one where he laughs at this promise from the angels. Okay, so it's clear to us that if God was kind of gauging their faith or faithfulness, then both Abraham and Sarah, with their laughter, failed the test. Like they show that, look, God, am telling you, I will give you a son a year from today, and you laugh in my face. Okay, clearly, I know you think I'm a joke. Okay, and Abraham again fails the test of faithfulness, of trust in God, in the Avimer episode. Just as he's failed decades earlier. Oh, and that's another thing, when you said that Abraham is reasonable in doubting God, you have to remember also that years pass between each of these episodes that we're reading. Okay, so it's not just, another year passed without a son. A decade passed without a son. Another decade passes. And without another conversation with God. Again, between these different conversations, years and years pass sometimes. So God picks the name of the baby to remind Abraham and Sarah of their doubt in God. Remind them of their bad faith. Remind them that they laughed at God's promise, and that they laughed at God's word, at His commitment to them, at His ability. With the idea, it seems to me, like, why have this name? To remind you of that scene, so that every time they see this boy running around, and every time they call this boy to dinner, it'll be a reminder that they failed that test, but that they shouldn't have. It's a reminder to have faith in God, because God, it's a reminder to not doubt God's fidelity moving forward. Because this is that bona fide miracle that you asked for. Again, you, David. Okay, when I asked you, if you got that miracle, whatever it is, and then God created some sort of way to force you to remember that moment when you saw that miracle, it'll reinforce it every time. Okay, so every time you call Isaac by name, it's a reminder, I didn't believe, I should have believed, and I should, from now on, believe without a doubt. Okay? To not doubt God's alliance with me, Abraham. Do not doubt God's care for me, for Abraham. And not doubt God's ability to do the impossible. Okay? Because again, now they have the ultimate proof running around in their tent. Again, the ultimate sign that that Abraham demanded from the start. Not from the start, but Abraham kept asking for a sign. And the signs weren't good enough. This sign is good enough. Okay, so the miraculous birth and the boy's name are something to keep in mind when we try to understand how Abraham trusted God's judgment when God made the most incomprehensible demand of him, which will happen in the very next conversation that they have. Okay, the slaughter. This is going to be the 7th conversation about the slaughter of Isaac. Okay, so the mere mention, when God tells them, "Go and sacrifice Isaac," again, the name is a reminder: trust God. Okay, the mere mention of Isaac's name is a lesson and a reminder that God keeps his promises, that God is faithful to Abraham, that God provides for Abraham and protects him, and that Abraham should trust God, or should trust that God knows what he's doing, even if Abraham doesn't know what God's doing. Okay, that somebody is at the wheel here. It doesn't make any sense to me, but I had my miracle. I asked for a miracle. This is an undeniable miracle. Trust in God. Okay, look, if you remember, again, when we started this issue with Abraham about his faith, we established that any one of us, that the crisis of the man of faith, or the predicament of the man of faith, is that you cannot know if you're delusional or if this is really God. Okay, and what you really want, the only way to know for sure, is to demand that God prove himself to you, but by performing a miracle. Okay? Now, the problem is that God will not humble himself for you or me. To prove, he's not going to perform a miracle for us so that you believe in him. Okay, but he does it for Abraham. Probably the only one. Actually, I don't know. But in any case, he does it for Abraham. Okay, he reveals himself to Abraham in various visual forms, and Abraham clarifies, not good enough. Okay, we see evidence that Abraham still doubts. And God sees evidence that Abraham still doubts, and Abraham says it outright. But now, with this birth, now Abraham knows for certain that it's not a voice in his head or visions that are a product of his imagination. It's again a baby born to a 91-year-old woman who stopped ovulating years ago. Okay. And if you you can see the shock and awe and happiness at this birth, again, at this obvious miracle that comes after 30 years, 40 years or so of Abraham, again, feeling like he's thrown away his life for this voice in his head, being racked by doubt for all these years. If you look at verse 5 through 7.
Mm-hmm.
21. Yeah.
So now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And she added,
we'll laugh. Maybe with me. I read it as "will laugh at me." But okay, go ahead.
And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would suckle children? Yet I have borne a son in his old age." The child grew up and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned.
Yeah. So again, this was a miracle boy, and that's how he's received by Sarah. Okay, and actually, the nice thing here, at least in Hebrew, she uses the word, she uses the name Isaac, and then uses the word laugh, twice in celebration of the birth. So it's So again, the name Isaac in Hebrew is Yitzchak, and the verb laugh is tzachak. So, Vatomer Sarah tzchok asali Elohim kol shomea yitzchak li. Okay, so she calls him, Bivaled Yitzchak bno. Vatomer Sarah tzchok asali Elohim kol shomea yitzchak li. Okay, so Isaac. So the very existence of this boy and his very name is constant proof that Abraham needs to have full and complete faith in God as a real ally, as a reliable ally and provider and protector. And it explains to us. Remember, we started, what's the name of that author I told you about? I emailed you about.
Oh.
What was his name? I keep saying Milgram, but it's not that. The guy who said that we need to read in large chunks. The Eclipse of Biblical Narrative. Borgman, there we go.
Yeah.
It's an indication for us that that God kind of is true to his his word. But the issue for the question it raises is that I'm sorry. So what it explains is Abraham's bizarre behavior when God tells him kill the son. Okay, so Borgman told us you can't just read this final scene because it really does seem monstrous. But when you read the story of their relationship with all of its levels, now you understand, because again, this is no longer a man with a voice in his head telling him to kill your son. This is a man who's already seen bona fide proof, incontrovertible truths, that this is not some crazy voice in his head. This is the real God of the universe who has shown, again in incontrovertible terms, that he knows what he's doing, he's true to his word, he cares for Abraham, he knows what's best for Abraham, and he's got the power to make his promises come true. Okay, so again, if somebody who does something because he thinks God told him something is very different than somebody doing something because God, the real God really is telling him to do it. Completely different thing, obviously. And so Borgman is, that's why Borgman says that, about, again, the biblical narrative, that when we read it in episodes, as we all do, we're missing the literary mechanisms that convey important parts of the story to us. Okay? And when people sat at the campfire and listened to the whole story, they got it in a way that we don't when we read one chapter at a time. Because again, so by now, having read all these conversations, these 7 conversations, we at the murder scene, at the sacrifice scene, we should understand that it's no longer faith that Abraham has in God. Okay, his trust in God is no longer based on faith, but based on experience and verifiable fact. Thanks to that, so thanks to that miracle birth, Abraham is no longer a man of faith, with all the doubts that are inherent in faith. in religious faith. Okay? Abraham doesn't believe in God. Abraham knows for certain that, based on, again, actual experience, that God is real, and not just his experience, we can all see, that this is not a delusion. He knows for a fact that God is real, God is with him, God knows what's best for him and wants what's best for him, and that God knows what he's doing even if Abraham does not. So now that we've established this through this long story of the previous 10 chapters, now you can read the 7th conversation, this final episode in the Abraham story, and understand it in context. Okay? So this conversation, the 7th conversation, starts when God demands Isaac as sacrifice, and it ends 3 days later at the scene of the sacrifice on Mount Moriah. Okay, so God says, Abraham, do this for me. Abraham does it, and then God responds to the act. So just when it seems that the story has ended happily, again, God's promise is fulfilled, then the hammer comes down, and God speaks to Abraham, again, for the 7th time, and basically everything that God provided, God now threatens to destroy. Everything that Abraham waited for decades for, God now says, throw it into the fire. Slaughter your son, sacrifice him to me. Okay. Now, so in this demand, I want you to see how the author conveys to us just how terrible this test is by looking at how at the literary construction of God's words to Abraham, and in the literary construction of Abraham's reaction, and by Isaac's reaction, which we've already talked about a few weeks ago. And again, so we're at 22 verse 1. Yeah, 22.
I have sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham.
Wait. Could you read it again?
Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test.
Excellent. Okay.
He said to Abraham, Abraham. And he answered, here I am.
Right.
And he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah.
Oh, that's terrible. I cannot believe your translator. He ruined everything. That was terrible. Okay, so let's take these two separately. That's a terrible translation. It ruined the okay, I'll show you in a bit. So I call this a terrible test. I call it a test because the text tells us right off the bat that God is testing Abraham. Mm-hmm. Okay? In verse 1. But test, like you and I can't know what this means. Okay? Because a test could be merely a test, meaning that Abraham thinks it's real, but we, the readers, know that it's merely a test, that God doesn't really seek child sacrifice. Okay, so that could be the test, meaning merely a test. But test could also mean a real, like a serious test, meaning that God really does want Isaac to be slaughtered and sacrificed, and that this is the real test of Abraham's devotion to God. How devoted are you? Will you give up your most prized possession? Okay, and we don't know until the very end, and because again, the test could be, both of these are a test. So it's kind of like what? look, it's like, we just had Halloween. When your kid has, M&Ms, and you say, "Will you give me your M&Ms?" Yeah? Like, it might be that you're testing just to see if the kid will part with his prized M&Ms, and you know that you don't really want them, and you're going to give them back. That's one sort of test. But another test is to really test whether he'll give them to you because you want to eat them, and see whether your child will be angry, resentful that you're eating, quote unquote, his M&Ms. Okay, they're both tests. Okay, but one is merely a test of the kind of intention of the kid, and the other is a test of the kid's devotion to you, submissiveness to you, care for you, whatever. Okay, and we don't know that. We don't know, and Abraham doesn't. Well, Abraham certainly doesn't know. Okay, so if so, the clarification that the text offers us in verse 1. Again, everything seemed fine, and now 22, and after these, God tested Abraham and told him, "Take your son," blah blah blah. Okay, so the fact that the test is reassuring us, hey, it's a test, isn't really reassuring. Okay, it doesn't clarify what kind of test it is. Is it merely a test, or is it a test? Yeah, if we're wondering whether God, our God, is like pagan gods who demand child sacrifice, this doesn't clarify it to us. 22 verse 1 doesn't clarify it to us. Okay, so if we're trying to find whether our God is like those pagan gods, we need to find it elsewhere. Okay? We're still in suspense, and in fact, we'll remain in suspense, just like Abraham and Isaac will be, all the way to the very end until the dagger is lifted. Okay, so we are riding this train of uncertainty along with all the characters. I mean, okay, not with God, but with Abraham and Isaac. And at that point, we will find out retroactively that 22 verse 1, when they said test, they meant merely a test. It wasn't a real demand. Only at the end do we find out that our God is not like other gods of that time and place. He's not a God that requires child sacrifice. So I told you that the author reveals to us through a literary technique that your translator ruined, that God understands how terrible this test is in the way that this demand is constructed, the literary construction of it. So, could you read yours again, verse 2?
For verse 2, it says, "And he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of your heights."
Yeah, that's okay.
On one of the heights.
Yeah. So, in the Hebrew original, do you have the Hebrew original?
I do.
Okay. So, take a look and see the difference. Because, again, could you repeat again the English version that you had?
At the very beginning, "And he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go."
Whom you love, right, okay. Now in Hebrew, it says, "And he said, take your son," actually it says, "Please take your son." That's a nice touch too. But it says, "Please take your son, your only," meaning your only son. "Please take your son, your only, whom you love, Isaac, and go da 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 da."
Yeah, so he's got Ishmael makes things complicated.
Right. So when you have this construction, again, take your son, your only son, whom you love, the son you love, take Isaac. What's the effect here?
Your son, which one? I have two sons, Ishmael, Isaac. Your only son. Wait, I don't have an only
I don't
son.
have an only.
Ishmael,
I see.
Isaac. You're the one that you love. Well, I love Ishmael and Isaac.
Well, yeah,
Isaac.
yeah, exactly. Okay, so the noose is tightening. Okay, God is saying, take your son. Who? Okay, it as this is happening, it's kind of like, look, if you think of those army people who come to deliver the death notice of your son in battle. You see them walking down the street, like, again, assuming it's time of war. You know that somebody's getting that dreaded notice. Okay, you see that they're walking. Now they're walking on your side of the street. Okay. Is it my son? Is it the neighbor's son? Now they're turning into your house. It might be a wrong address. They're knocking on your door and saying, "Are you Mr. Jones?" Okay, so the noose is tightening and tightening and tightening. Abraham keeps getting a clearer and clearer message about who it is that God is targeting here. And there's always doubt, and at some point, at the end of this process, the fourth iteration, God leaves no doubt, by naming Isaac by name. And at that point, okay, so take your son, your only son, the son you love, take Isaac, okay, and then he brings the hammer down. Sacrifice him to me. Okay. Now another, so that's just, again, it's just and do you see how your translator just ruined the whole effect by inserting Isaac's name before he doesn't even mention your only son, and before the son you love. That's terrible. Now, another literary observation that you'll see in the Hebrew, but actually, tell me how it is in English. So, when he says Isaac, so after he says, take your son Isaac, how does it read for you in English? Verse 2.
Verse 2, take your son Isaac, and then it says, your favored one.
Uh-huh.
And then it says Isaac.
Uh-huh.
And then it says, whom you love. And then it says, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering.
Okay, now if you turn to chapter 12, verse 1, this is the very first conversation between God and Abraham. What's the...
It says, go
Pardon?
from your native land,
Wait,
from your father's...
The audio was blocked. It says, God said what?
And the Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Okay,
so it says go forth. But for Isaac, it doesn't say go forth to the land of Moriah. It just says go.
It says, go to the land of Moriah. Okay. They're the same word.
Yeah, so in Hebrew, in both cases, it says lekhah. Okay, you go. Okay, lech is the command go. And lekhah is thine self, kind of. Go thine self, go you, you go. Okay. So it's very noticeable, the repetition here, or this phrase, lekh. Go, you go from your land. What you have as go forth is you go from your birthplace, your father's house, to the land that I will show you. Okay, that's in the first conversation. You go from your land and your birthplace and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And here, in their last conversation, you say, you hear, take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, and lekh, and you go to the land of Moriah, to the mountain I will show you, and sacrifice him there. Okay, so the similarity in both lekh and to the land that I will show you. Okay, now I say that the repetition here is noticeable, Yeah, because this phrase appears only twice in the Bible, and it's these two times.
Lekhah.
Lekhah. Okay? Okay? So you go to the land that I will show you. You go to the mountain that I will show you. Okay? This phrasing clearly and purposefully links these two conversations, the first and the last. Okay? So what is the purpose? What is the author? So again, the author, again, unless you're blind to the literary techniques here, or unless you're just thinking that the author, that it's haphazard, that it's just a coincidence. But assuming that this is high literature, the author is calling upon us to remember that demand. This demand, that demand. Go to the land that I will show you, go to the mountain that I will show you. Lekh, lekh. So what is the author trying to say to us with this linkage? Or maybe what is God trying to say to Abraham with this linkage? Because again, we're noticing the same words. Maybe Abraham, again, it's been 40 years probably since the first conversation, but maybe Abraham also remembers God's very first words to him. Lekh lecha me'artzecha ela eretz asher arecha. Okay, so what is the author trying to tell us? What is God trying to tell Abraham by linking these two conversations?
In the first episode, this phrase was used to, I guess, mark his journey from his ancestral land and his ancestors to the path that God lays out for him. And then this might mark, because everything changes after this. There's no more conversations with God.
Right.
There's no more Isaac. Sarah dies after this. He has a new wife, a new family, and things are different. So it's like at the beginning of a new chapter.
Right, but look, so look, you're right.
Or that this is the hardest thing that I'm going to ask you to do. Leave your fatherland and all the ancestors, and now.
Right. Yeah, that one seemed like a very hard demand, and this, so look, it could be, as you said, that this marks the end of this chapter of Abraham's life. Again, for us. Again, Abraham can't know this. I mean, this is not God's message to Abraham, but for us readers, it could kind of wrap it up in a bow. The relationship, kind of, the story started there. This is the last conversation. But I think to your second observation, it's linking the scenes. It says that was a hard ask. This is a hard. Basically, it says to us, the audience, and to Abraham, that this scene is like that scene. This ask is like that this demand is like that demand. Okay, so recall that last time I told you, you go, lekh lecha, to a place that I'll show you. Recall, again, this is God. But by linking these two scenes with these phrases, God is signaling to Abraham, or the author is signaling to us, recall that last time you heard these words, God, came through. Recall that I really am God. Recall that I really am your ally. Recall that I really do look out for you. Recall that I provide for you, I don't take from you. Okay, and add to this connection, this scene is like that scene. Recall that you doubted, but I've proven myself to you. I'm not some imaginary voice in your head. I care for you, I provide for you, I don't take from you. So it seems like like a tremendous demand, but remember that I really am God. And add to that the fact that he says, take Isaac. And the name Isaac itself is a reminder. Don't forget, I really am God. I already proved it to you. I really am your ally. You laughed, but I've proven to you that you can trust me. Trust my judgment. Don't be afraid. Okay. And actually, another similarity between these two conversations that you won't see until after the murder scene is that the original promise, like again, every conversation between God and Abraham ends with God re-promising that original promise in some sort of version of it. The first in the first conversation, God's promise ends the same way that God's the last part of God's promise to Abraham in the first conversation and after the Isaac scene on Mount Moriah includes that Abraham will become a great nation and that all the families of the earth will be blessed through his progeny. Okay? The only two times that element, that all the nations of the earth will be blessed by Abraham's seed, is in God's promise in the first lekhah and God's promise in the last lekhah. Okay? So again, it's these two scenes are clearly connected for us. Partly as a literary whole, as you suggest, but partly it's a reminder that to us, I think mostly to Abraham, don't forget what you've learned through these 7 encounters. You demanded them, you were in doubt. I showed myself to you. I talked to you. I provided for you. I provided you the miracle that you demanded. Okay, so don't let that fear, meaning that faithlessness, creep in. Remember that I really am who I say I am. And therefore, again, you can jump off that bridge. Okay, because you're no longer a man of faith. This is not faith in God. This is knowledge. Because you got that bona fide miracle. So how about Abraham's response? Okay, so the message is coded. How about verse 3? What do you make of? How do you make sense of that?
That's strange.
Okay, so read it to me in the English, just so I make sure that it's similar.
So early next morning.
So again, it ends. Verse 2 ends with, "Sacrifice him on one of the hills that I will show you." Okay, and then.
Mm-hmm. So early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out to the place of which God had told him.
Okay, so it's a bit more action-packed in the Hebrew. So it says, and Abraham rose early in the morning and prepared his donkey and took the 2 boys with the 2 servants with him, and took Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the sacrifice, and he got up and he went to the place that God showed him or told him. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it adds 2 more verbs to what you had. So he did this and 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 did this. Okay, so why is it weird? So again, sacrifice your son to me. And God and Abraham does this and does this and does this and he gets up early in the morning and does this and this and this and this and this and this. Why is it weird to you? I mean, you're right, but why is it weird?
He doesn't question God. Like in the Sodom and Gomorrah scene that we saw earlier, there's a back and forth. He questions, like, is this really what you want to do? And he brings him down to 5 people. And this, like, it's his most beloved thing in the entire world, and no questions asked, early in the morning, let's get it done.
Right, and it's after Abraham was told, I forget in which episode, I think 18, when God tells him, okay, send Ishmael away, do what Sarah says. So after he's told to send off your one son, now he's told to kill off his other son. Again, to which, or the one that God had promised Abraham for decades, that you'll get this son, never showed it, and then finally this son shows up, and this is the son through which God promised Abraham, again, a family and a nation, and God is undoing all of that. And like you said, Abraham's response is very silent and very active. Okay, so look, you're right that the silence is in sharp contrast to the destruction of Sodom, where God argues and argues, and he's this advocate for these evil people in Sodom. Okay, he's an advocate because he doesn't say just save the 100 good ones, or the 10 good ones, or the 5 good ones. He says save the entire town for those handful of good people. Okay, so he's arguing with God. It's like a courtroom. Okay, here he doesn't say a thing. Okay, but also he's very active. Okay, so what's this combination of silence and action? What is it? Because look, you're right. Look, if this were a modern movie, I'll say it this way: if this were a modern movie, how would the director have Abraham act the moment after God tells him, take your son, or kill your son?
Him preparing to take his son, like direct montage to the preparations and taking his son toward Mount Moriah.
Yeah, no. I mean, that's if they put this script into film. But I'm saying if a modern author wanted to tell the story of Abraham, what would you think Abraham's response in verse 3 would be? This is an uncommon verse 3. How would a modern author
would zoom in on Abraham's face and being like utterly destitute, it was like Abraham would fall to his knees, tear his clothes maybe, or maybe just the author would describe Abraham's heartbrokenness and despair and da-da-da-da. We don't see it. It's just silence and doing stuff. So I think what it seems to me, actually, what's the signal that you're getting from this? From this stone silence and doing things. He's not questioning. The questioning that was there is no longer there.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely true. But this action, this silent action.
That he's, I guess that he's, I don't think of the right way to put it, bought into the program of God. That no questioning, just we're going to do and go through with what the direction is. Like drink the Kool-Aid or something.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't think of, I didn't see it that way, but you're right. It could be taken that way. Okay, that this guy is totally on board. God said jump, I'm jumping, and I not bothered. To me,
or that he doesn't think he's going to follow through with it.
But we do know within 2 verses that he is following through, because he goes to Mount Moriah.
By doing that, he would completely undermine everything that has come before, and that maybe Abraham thinks that there's no way that's going to happen. So I'm just going to.
Yeah. So I think, well, that could be the case, and we'll see it later in there's this vague element of the conversation with Isaac that might suggest what you're saying now. But to me, look, the way I studied this, I was taught this in high school, is that is that this silent doing indicates inner turmoil. Okay, and my teacher at the time pointed out that it's very similar to Jewish mourning rituals. Okay, so when somebody in the family, somebody close, passes away, you're required to do all these things. You know, like again, I don't know how it is in Christianity or Christianities. What are the traditions? But the spouse that stays behind, or the parent of a child who passed away, you have to do all these things, all these ritual things that you have to do, and then you host people who come to your house, and you have to feed them and clean up after them and everything else. And there's this suggestion that that it's kind of a process of mourning, or that it's good for you to keep busy as you're mourning, because otherwise you're just being tortured. Okay, so what she suggested to us at the time is that this is Abraham kind of going through this mourning. You know, where he's doing it, but it's silent, it's grave, but he's just doing things as he was told. And then the silence continues as they're walking for 3 days. And again, I agree with you that it stands in sharp contrast, this silence. You know, God tells them do this terrible thing, and ever since then there's this deathly silence, which again is a sharp contrast to the Sodom scene. But again, the difference is that in the Sodom scene, Abraham still doubted God, doubted God's judgment, wondered whether God knows what he's doing, whether God is trustworthy. Now here, Abraham knows, and again, it's not that he believes. Abraham knows, and he doesn't argue with God. You know, he's
the weird part,
you know,
with the Sodom scene, though, like, there are those men or angels or messengers who go into Sodom, and they do save Lot and his family.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was, it's unclear as to whether that was because of Abraham's intervention or
not. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because Abraham was not calling to save the righteous.
Everyone, right? Just if there were this many righteous people.
Yeah.
And it got down to 5, and Lot and his 2 daughters and his wife are 4.
Yeah, couldn't even do that. Yeah, that's a good. It might be that they saved him because, again, this is Abraham's family, and all these peoples that are coming from Abraham's families are promised land in the area. But in any case, so here, you know, so that was before the Sodom scene, the haggling was before Abraham had this true trust in God and belief that God really is who he is. This is after. Okay, so this is a different Abraham, and therefore he is obedient. But the way I was taught it, and therefore the way I read it, this action-packed scene and the silence and the heavy silence suggests to me that he's not at peace. You know, it's not like, oh well, it's been nice knowing you, Isaac. And in this respect, you might have noticed that on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place that God said, and he told the boys, he told the servants, okay, Yeah. He said, I and the boy will go there and worship and come back to you. Okay, so we're going up the hill. You stay here till we come back. Okay, it says in the plural, we will worship and we will return to you. Okay, so you're saying that maybe Abraham is thinking that this won't happen because it'll undo everything. It doesn't make sense that God would do this, so maybe it won't happen. So what does this tell you about Abraham's thinking? I mean, what are the possibilities when you see this message to the servants? What are the different ways that Abraham's words can be understood?
Either he's lying and hiding something from his servants, or he's believes what he's telling the servants and doesn't believe God is going to make him go through with it.
Right. I would add
or
one more.
somehow they're going to come back down together.
Right. So I would add one more option. So either, as you say, either he's lying to the servants, or he's thinking or hoping or thinking that this is merely a test rather than a real test. Okay, God isn't really going to take my M&Ms. He just wants to see whether I'll get. Because look, you're when you do this with your kids, after you do it once and give back the M&Ms, the next time you do that that test, the kid already has experienced this once, and you think, okay, Dad is not really going to eat my chocolates. He's not a real monster. He just wants to see me perform this act of generosity. Okay? So maybe Abraham, the three options are that Abraham is lying to the servants, or he thinks that this might be merely a test rather than a real test where he's really going to be expected to kill the boy. Or he's not telling the truth, not because he's lying to the boys, but he wants to keep what he knows from Isaac. Okay, that he's not lying to them because he's ashamed, but he doesn't want to scare Isaac. Okay, but so is your sense that is your sense that he meant to slaughter his son?
My sense is I might probably just put myself in. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He's going along right now.
Yeah.
And it's not, and the fact that he has to go along so far to where the knife is coming down, and that's when the moment of truth is. To me, suggests at this point that he doesn't quite know.
Yeah. So obviously, when the knife is coming down, we know that Abraham is killing his son.
Ready to sacrifice his son.
At that point, we know. Okay. Here, again, think of yourself as reading this for the first time. It seems like a terrorizing scene, but then it says we will
come back.
We will come back. Oh, okay. We will come back. Okay, so what is going on here? Is Abraham going to kill it? Is he not? So again, we don't know. We, the readers, don't know what's in Abraham's heart, and it might be that Abraham doesn't know either. On the other hand, it might be that Abraham does know. He's just lying. Lying because he doesn't want to seem like a monster to the servants, or lying in order to protect Isaac. One of the two. Overall, so far, are you again with the benefit of Borgman's method of reading? Are you as an audience? What do you think of Abraham? Like, are you impressed or unimpressed, or are you scandalized by him, or do you pity him, or do you respect him? Like, what's your... reaction to this story. Again, we know that when we read this episodically, all of us are scandalized. Obviously, he's just seemed like a monster. Okay. With the context that Borgman offers, or that the Bible, the biblical author, offer, does he still seem like a monster? Is he an object of anger? I don't know if anger is the word, but are you scandalized by it, or do you pity him, or are you impressed by him, or what?
So it seems, in my mind, the issue is so far he's never been willing to go to the edge, like the knife at the throat, and like let it get to the part where it's unknown to him what's going to happen. So he's always hedged. He came down to Egypt and he sacrificed Sarah to hedge. And in this scene, he comes all the way up to the edge and the threshold where the knife is coming down. And whether he should have crossed that to there's a tension. I can see it both ways.
Huh.
Like, which is probably a good, but it's not hard to see it as being still monstrous, even though he's had this whole history where things have come through. But even then, does it make it all right?
Yeah. Well, but again, look, it's.
But on the other end, this faith that there's something higher, bigger, something great that you can.
Well, and again, it's not
sacrifice everything for.
Yeah, but look, Satan is also something higher and great, like bigger and everything else. So this is God. Okay, and this is no longer a belief. You know, after all the scrapes that Abraham's been through, and after the miracle birth and everything else, Abraham comes to trust based on, again, not based on faith, but based on verifiable fact.
But is the verifiable fact that miracles can happen? He can see that this being can make things happen that shouldn't happen.
Wait, could you repeat? It just the audio was garbled. Can't. Not coming through.
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Again?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So, what's been established by the birth of Isaac is that we have a being that can make things happen that shouldn't happen.
Right.
Does that mean that you should do what that being says?
Right. Obviously, it could be kind of like the magicians in Egypt.
Right. Or the Satan. If we say that the Satan can make things, has some kind of power that is more than.
Yeah.
Should we do the Satan says?
Yeah.
I don't know if power isn't compelling enough.
Your audio is cutting in and out, but I got what you were saying, that
by miraculous power is it?
Yeah, the powers to do supernatural things doesn't indicate that you are necessarily the God of the universe. Okay, but
miracles now to show that somebody should do what this being says, and if Satan can do miracles, then so what's the test to see if you should do what a divine being says, and whether you're understanding that divine being correctly, which I think is also strange in this context because of the different names for God that come throughout.
Right, but
Elohim we have.
Yeah, but look, you have to remember that the audience that is hearing this story, this the audience for the Bible, for the biblical story, is an audience that ostensibly is monotheistic. Okay? So look, if you're a monotheist, then and look, there's no Satan in the Bible, or there's certainly not in not in the Bible at all. Yeah, as a celestial being with spiritual powers or supernatural powers. There's no character like that in the Bible. So so within a monotheistic framework, it is true that the only person, the only character, the only being that can perform miracles, supernatural events, is God. Baal can't do it. Molech can't do it. Nobody can do it. The only person, the only thing that can make the sun stop in its tracks, the only thing that can make, all the miracles in the Bible happen, including the birth of Isaac, is the God of the universe. Okay? Because there's no other divine being in the world.
Well, the magicians aren't doing anything. This is later, so this is...
Yeah, no. Look, the magicians is a good... we'll talk about this. It's a very interesting thing about the 10 plagues in Egypt. That why isn't Pharaoh convinced by God's miracles? Okay, and he's not convinced by the first or the second or the third or the third, but he is convinced by the last one, by the 10th plague, and so there's a reason. So let's not get into this now. But clearly, there are magic tricks that are magic. I mean, that are tricks. They're not real magic. Like when you and I see somebody throwing down a staff and it becomes a snake, you and I understand. I mean, we don't understand how it happens, but we understand this is not real magic. Okay, it's a trick. Okay, and the same thing when we see the magician sawing a woman in half, we're not calling the police because we understand it's a trick. Okay, but if we saw if we saw some creature, some being, really sawing a woman in half to our satisfaction, and she's dead, and then he puts her together and brings her back to life, you and I, again, if this is done to our satisfaction, that this is not some sort of trick within the natural world, but a real woman who was really sawed in half, really was dead, and really was put together and now is alive and talking, you and I would know, okay, that is God. That is not a magician. That is not a magic trick. The only person in the whole universe who could do, the only being who could do this is God. Okay? And so again, within the monotheistic framework, God has proven that he is God, the God of the universe.
Can there still be an ambiguity? So the only other ambiguity I have is the names, and like the message is coming, like I could still question whether I'm interpreting or hearing something that's in my imagination or something that is the biblical God. Like just because I've seen the biblical God do something and then I hear something later.
Okay, so I've had a relationship with the real God, but this time it might be an error.
It's my imagination.
Yeah, this time it might be an error. I'm sure it occurs to him. I'm sure. I mean, actually, let me take it back. That's a good point. Okay, so I have a relationship with the real God. I'm convinced that God really did what he did. But now I might be crazy. Yeah.
Right. Now I might be misunderstanding it.
Yeah. Okay, so what do you think?
Because the support I have is that he changes names, like it becomes Elohim, then it goes back to Yod-Heh, Vav-Heh, then it just keeps changing, like who he's, and if Elohim is ambiguous and could mean more than just Yod-Heh, Vav-Heh.
Yeah, but look, it's not ambiguous throughout the Bible. Like it's clear whenever Elohim is deployed, it's deployed in this to convey God or the Lord or JHVH, etc.
But no, the sons of Elohim who come down and mate with the, that's weird. And then there's other parts where Elohim is just like interpreted or at least translated as divine being and not as the biblical God.
Where?
I can't. I got.
Yeah. Okay. Email me about that because that's interesting to me. I'm not aware of that. I mean, it sometimes it does. Like God mocks the Israelites and says, "Go worship those gods." You know, go worship when the Israelites kind of wander into foreign worship. He says, "Go worship your other gods," but it's clear at that point that it's gods in the plural rather than gods in the singular, which is the God. But okay, so let's assume that Abraham might be wondering whether he's crazy or not, even after it was proven to him that God is the God, but maybe this is a new voice in my head. But he knows now that he never had a voice in his head. He's never been. When I wondered if I was crazy before, I wasn't crazy. That was the real. All those conversations were real. I now know because of Isaac. So maybe this is a brand new episode of craziness. Perhaps. Okay. So overall, your perception of Abraham is that basically he's still blameworthy for murderousness because he cannot be sure that this really is. Okay, I'll ask it this way. If you knew, as you know, because you know the story, that this really is God, then then do you think that you would be blameworthy for plunging the knife? If God, again, the author of divine justice, of justice, period, is telling you to do something that you think is terrible, but you're just a human being. But God, who to your satisfaction really is God, is telling you to do it, are you blameworthy for doing it? Because look, there's a contest here between God's idea of justice,
right? Yeah,
and your idea of justice. Okay, so I understand your point is that here is that, look, Abraham is blameworthy because he does not know for certain that this is the same God that he spoke, that this really is God. This might be just a voice. Okay, so I get it. But if Abraham does know the truth, as you and I do, the readers know that this really is God. Okay, if Abraham knows it too, is he a monster? Is he somewhat a monster? Or is he a good person? Or some other option? Like, well, I was just wondering what you think of him.
Kierkegaard, this is the only, in Fear and Trembling talks about this story and raises this weird question where if I only trust my own conscience, or if Abraham only trusts his own conscience, then he can never be wrong. Which means that it's an act of hubris, that you can never be wrong, or you think that you're better, or that you know right and wrong, or just and bad, or good and evil better than something bigger than you. On the other hand, why should you trust something just because they demonstrate power? Isn't there like a law of justice that we all understand and live by? And then the question becomes whether you can hold power or a divine being or God to the same laws of justice that you have. I think they're all very it's complicated intersection.
Yeah. Look, there's I mean, it's not a real it's not a biblical story, but it's I don't know what you call it in English, a midrash, where God basically tells the Jews, tells the rabbi, I think in the Sanhedrin in Babylonia, to do something that is that contradicts the Torah. Okay? And then this whole debate starts between the rabbis and God over which is the true law. God's will, as expressed by God, or God's Torah, which is recorded on paper. And the verdict, I forget what it's called, but the verdict is the Torah supersedes. Okay? When God's voice says X and the Torah says Y, we go with the Torah. But that's when there's a Torah. Okay? Abraham didn't have that. If we put to the side your point about the fact that this still might be a voice, okay? This might be a voice, in which case you have to verify. Basically, you have to ask this voice for a miracle again. Prove to me that you're God, and then I'll do what you're doing. But let's put that to the side. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, which we happen to know is also true, that this really is God, and that Abraham believed that this really was the God who, again, the monotheistic God. Then the question is what you just said, well, we quoted Kierkegaard, as presenting when the human understanding of justice, of goodness, clashes with God's revealed will or understanding of justice, which should trump? Because here, Abraham doesn't think it's right, but God tells him this is right. Okay, and so can you accept Abraham's conduct as good? Again, putting to the side the possibility that this is just a crazy voice in his head.
I come here and I'm a little perplexed. Like when I get to that point, answering the question that you just articulated, do you
look? This is this is that plunge. This is jumping off the bridge. Okay, because you're saying, I accept that you are God. You know better. Your understanding of justice is greater than mine. I submit to yours. Okay, I am not greater than you in terms of justice, wisdom, moral knowledge. You're greater than me.
Well, the perplexity would come from conceding power, but not conceding justice. So you're the author of the world, you made everything, but you're asking me to do something that I, as a being that you made, don't think it's just to do.
Right. Yeah. No, so the question is, like, who do we monotheists think has better moral knowledge, better moral judgment? Because look, you can go back to Cain and God. Obviously, Cain did something that he thought was right. Cain wasn't acting against. Adam, when he ate the fruit, acted against his conscience, or against his knowledge, moral knowledge. Cain didn't. Lekh certainly didn't. Okay, so look, we have our own consciences, and it's a big question. Should what is the role of your conscience compared to God's revealed commandments? Look, if in the Torah it's written, "Thou shalt," I don't know, do terrible things. Okay, are you commanded by your own conscience not to follow, or are you commanded by the Torah? Which commandment should you follow? Your conscience that tells you that doesn't seem, the Torah seems wrong, or should you follow the commandment of the Torah, because the Torah embodies more moral wisdom than you do. than your conscience does. It's a big battle, and we'll revisit this again. But what you see here, at least from Abraham, and again, it might be a tough one for readers, but for Abraham, after all the scrapes he's been through in Egypt, in Galal, 4 kings, leaving his home and surviving, the first lekhah, and after Isaac's birth, Abraham has come to really trust, again, based on experience, not based on faith, to trust that even when it seems to his human eye that God is not minding the store, God is minding. And God is working to keep his promise. He's going to keep it on God's schedule, not Abraham's. Again, Abraham thought that he'd have a son 30 years ago. Okay, and so Abraham, for decades, God gave Abraham reason to fear that God's promise was bunk. Where are all the children that God promised? Where's the kingdom I was promised? How could I become a great people if my own life is in danger in Egypt and in Gerar and in Canaan even, and if I have no son? Okay? But one by one, God has addressed these fears and proven them wrong. And so the result is, after 30, 40 years, Abraham really has come to trust that even if Abraham doesn't know what God is up to, God knows. And God is looking out for Abraham. Okay, so Abraham has come to trust God's judgment more than his own. Again, as the episode in Egypt proved in retrospect to him, and Gerar, etc. Okay? And that's why Abraham can overcome his conscience in a way that you can't. Okay? Abraham overcame his conscience and overcame his love for Isaac and overcame his fear and his doubt, and he submits to God's will. Okay, so he binds Isaac on the altar, not because he's afraid of God, of what God will do to me if I refuse.
Like that Bob Dylan song?
Yeah, Highway 61, yeah. So it's definitely not that. And Bob Dylan definitely has that wrong. Okay, Abraham ties Isaac up because he really trusts God. Okay, and maybe that's maybe we disagree with him whether he should or not, but it's clear that he does. Okay, he's not doing it out of fear. He does it because he trusts that God. I don't understand what God is doing. I don't understand why this is for. But I didn't understand numerous things beforehand, and obviously God understood. God is true to his word. God was true to his word. God knew. God looked out for me, etc. Okay. So Abraham, after Isaac's birth, came to really trust in God's heart. Okay, to trust God's commitment to provide for him, and God's power to provide for him, and God's desire to provide for him, for Abraham. Okay, so you see this complete trust in this ally. Okay, I trust, like when he tells me to jump off this bridge, I'm jumping because I know that he will catch me. Again, it's like that trust building exercises, where you fall backwards. Okay, so you can see here that Abraham, we know that this is a big demand because of the way God asked, the way Abraham responds, and everything else. But Abraham does it not because he's afraid, but because he's come to trust God's heart. And by the same token, God has now come to trust Abraham's heart. Okay, now that God sees Abraham lifting the dagger, God is convinced that Abraham truly and wholly trusts him. Okay, so just a brief aside about this issue about God's trust in Abraham's heart. look, later this, when we go back to that, to Egypt and the magicians and Moses and everything else, we're going to get very philosophical about this issue with God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Okay, we'll discuss whether the Torah claims that God is omnipotent, if that God is not just omnipotent, meaning that He can do anything, but that He's all-knowing. Okay, that because these are two, again, omniscience, omnipotence, and omniscience are two qualities that we, at least today, tend to attribute to God, and so we'll test them with regard to in that story. But for now, on this issue, what does the Abraham story tell you about whether God knows everything?
It would suggest he doesn't.
Right.
He doesn't know what Abraham's going to do. He doesn't know his.
Right.
His
Right. And in fact, and again, this part of the story, the very end of this scene, 22 verse 12. Okay, and he said, God said, or the angel, don't take your hand to the boy, and don't do anything to him, because now, well, actually, how does your mine? The Hebrew original has, because now I know that you are God-fearing, and didn't keep your son, your only son, from me. Meaning
So
that
in JPS it says, "For now I know that you fear God, since you
Okay.
have not withheld your son, your favored one."
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the now is the important part. Okay. So this it's not a matter of you and I kind of speculating whether God knows or doesn't know. Genesis 22:12 tells you explicitly, because of that word now. Okay. Now I know that you are God-fearing. At which point God again swears to give him everything, everything that he had promised him before. Okay, so again, our method of reading the Bible, since we started, is reading only the text, rather than adding to it based on our logic or morals or theology, etc. Okay, so we just read what the author tells us. And here the author tells, not even the author, here God tells us himself that he needed to see the knife plunged towards Isaac to know what's in Abraham's heart. He cannot see that Abraham has faith in him. He needs to see the action in order to know Abraham's heart, to see into Abraham's heart. How about earlier in the Abraham story? Can God see what's in Abraham's heart there? Can he see through his chest into his heart? Like if you think of, again, Egypt.
It's not until after. No, he interprets actions, I suppose.
Right.
So it's not until Abraham acts that there's any decision on what's in Abraham's heart.
Right. So, look, God could sense that Abraham doesn't trust him. But he sensed it, again, in Egypt, after the 4 kings, the Avimer story, when Abraham laughs in his face. Okay, so it doesn't take some sort of great, it doesn't take a mind reader. Like if I tell you, hey, David, blah, blah, blah is going to happen, and you laugh in my face, okay, I know that you don't believe me. Okay, it's not because I can read your mind. You basically told me, I don't believe you, you're full of it. Okay, so God sensed that Abraham was afraid, the sense that Abraham didn't trust God's promise, just like we readers did. Okay? We see Abraham's actions, or we hear Abraham's words, and that allows us to understand what's in his heart. Okay? And so we now, so beforehand, earlier in the story, God reads our minds, our hearts, through our actions. Okay? And now we find out that God, now at the very end of the story, God still doesn't know what's in Abraham's heart, even after Abraham got his miracle. God does not know whether Abraham was devoted to him, trusted him, had full faith in him. Okay, so God, before and now still, reads Abraham's heart by looking at Abraham's actions, okay? Or listening to what Abraham says, or his laughter. And again, so you can see that, just like you can see you can see Abraham now, during this seventh conversation, the seventh encounter, coming to really trust in God, trust in God's goodwill, caring, providence, etc., and trusting that God really is God. By the same token, God, or not by the same token, God doesn't know that until he sees the knife. Okay, at that point, you have this symmetry where Abraham trusts, believes in God, and God trusts and believes in Abraham. Okay, so in this respect, God is just like you and me. He doesn't read hearts and minds. We extrapolate from people's actions to know what's in their hearts and minds, and God's in the same boat. Okay? God doesn't have the power to make Abraham trust him, just like you don't have the power to make your wife trust you. Okay? God is frustrated that Abraham doesn't believe in him, doesn't trust him. But God can't transform Abraham's heart for him from the outside. Okay? He can only hope to demonstrate to Abraham over time that that God is worthy of that trust. And he does it in he does it in Egypt. He does it in Gerar by again rubbing Abraham's nose in it. He does it, he hopes, with a miracle, and he finds out that really did the trick. Okay, so we'll come back to this in Egypt again, but you see here this message that the Bible, or the Torah at least, doesn't seem to have our understanding about God's omniscience and omnipotence. Okay, so the point is that that Abraham demanded that God prove that he really is God, and he demanded a miracle, he demanded a sign, and when he got his proof, he believes, and he now trusts God's heart. And God is the same way. God demands that Abraham prove to him that he's a believer. Okay, so God also demands a sign. Okay, and when God gets his proof with a knife, again, just like Abraham, God believes it, and he now trusts Abraham's heart. Okay, so they go up the mountain, just the two of them. It's actually, somebody pointed out that the old man carries the light but dangerous stuff, the fire and the knife, whereas the young man carries the heavy but not dangerous stuff. So, not related to anything, but it's a nice observation. So they're marching up the hill, and actually it's a nice it's a nice literary method here, when in verse 6 to 10, where Abraham takes the wood and puts it on Isaac his son, etc., etc. It keeps up with this. It keeps. I hope it does the same thing in the English. In the English, yeah. it says, Abraham loads Isaac his son with the wood. And Isaac says to Abraham his father, and Abraham asks the question, and Isaac says, Father, and asks him, and then the father responds, Yes, son. And then Isaac, again, have that conversation about the offering, and Abraham responds, God will provide the lamb for the slaughter, son, or my son. Okay, so, and then it continues. Abraham binds Isaac his son, and then Abraham raises the knife to slaughter his son. Okay, so I think, again, the author's literary technique of building dramatic tension is clear. Okay, the author kind of batters us with this clash between the intimate and tender connection between them. Father, son, my son, my son, my son, my father. So you have this tender, the way that they're conversing or describing one another, on the one hand, and on the other, there's this violence that we readers know is about to happen. Okay, there's this clash between Isaac's sweet trust in his father and the father's silent betrayal of the son. And again, we already discussed the ominous conversation between them, in which the author tells us that Abraham took the wood, the fire, and the knife, but Isaac, when he asks, he omits the knife. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the point is that Isaac's omission of the knife conveys, again, this turmoil and terror building in his heart as he begins to suspect what the knife is for. Because again, it's only the two of them. There's nothing to slaughter. But in this respect, it's interesting. If you look at that conversation, which is again in 22. 8. Wait. Oh yeah. So 7, he's asking him, and in 8, Abraham responds to him. So how is it done in the English? That'll be interesting.
In 8 it says, and Abraham said, God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son. And the two men walked on together.
Great. Okay, that's exactly like in the Hebrew. Okay, so Abraham's answer. So if Isaac's question, here's the wood and the fire, but where's the lamb for the slaughter? Again, first the question is, hey, where is the lamb? But the elimination of the knife suggests that Isaac understands or fears that he might understand what's going to happen here. Okay. So the question gives us a glimpse into his mind or into his heart. The same with Abraham's answer. Okay, like if in your Bible, is it punctuated? Abraham's answer.
It says, and Abraham said, quote, God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son, end quote. And the two of them walked on together. And then God will see to his burnt offering, comma, my son. Yeah.
So, so obviously the Bible doesn't have quotation marks and doesn't have punctuation marks. So like, Gesundheit. Play around with it and see what you get. Like, what are different ways of reading Abraham's answer? Actually, let me ask it this way: how would you punctuate what you just read to me? The way that you read it. What if you had to add a comma, a period, whatever? Where would it go?
About and God will see to the sheep, comma, for his burnt offering, my son.
Why? What's the comma doing there? Because a comma separates.
And God will see to the sheep, separating that off, and then the comma Um, where is burnt off? Yeah, I guess the
Yeah,
comma before my son, and
right,
then you can get
right.
rid of the comma, and yeah,
Yeah. So like the comma, because look, when I say, David, will you come to the movie with me? Okay, it's David, comma, and then what I'm asking you. Or, will you come to the movie with me, comma, David? Okay, because so the comma is where you move from the sentence to the address.
Mhm.
Okay, um, so and that's how that's the common reading, and I'm not even saying that's I think it's right, but what's another way of reading this sentence?
and God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son.
Right. Yeah. So instead of a comma, it's like a dash.
Mhm.
Okay. That the son is the burnt offering. Okay. God will find himself a sacrificial lamb, my son. Okay. So so the second reading, which again we can't tell how the author read it or wrote it, or how the author intended it to be read. But it could be that the way the second reading starts as an answer to Isaac. God will find him a sacrificial lamb. And then there's an added bit, my son, which Abraham kind of mumbles to himself ruefully. Okay, and you can imagine a good orator reciting, when he's telling this story at the campfire, um,
Yeah,
reciting this very differently to his audience. Okay, God will find himself a sacrificial lamb, my son, versus God will find himself a sacrificial lamb, my son. Okay, so perhaps the biblical author phrased it this way to show us Abraham's heart. Again, just like we saw with Isaac's question, maybe the answer as well is written ambivalently to suggest that Abraham is kind of racing between hope that God will offer a reprieve and resentment against God, because these are the two readings. The first offer is kind of a hopeful one. Maybe is this is what Abraham is telling to reassure Isaac, but maybe this really is Abraham's hope. And the second reading is a resentful one against God for making me do this. So again, I've read this, I've checked this out. A lot of translators insert the comma before my son. And it's just a shame because it robs the readers of this layer that the author... I take it back. I don't know if the author placed it for us there on purpose, but the fact that there's no punctuation means that we can't know if there was a dash there or a comma there, and so it adds a kind of a literary level that we deny ourselves when we introduce the comma as if we know that was the original writing of the text. But,
no, I don't think.
yeah. Okay, so then, oh my goodness, it's 3:30. Okay, so then they get there, and there's this Deus ex machina ending to this suspense story. Because again, we're in suspense all the way. Do you know what Deus ex machina means? Have you come across this term in in Greek literature?
Is it like divine intervention?
Yeah, so it literally means God's out of the machine. God, so it's God from the machine, and what it means is it's a plot device from Greek theater in which the actors who are portraying gods would be brought into onto the stage by as if by miracle. Okay, so basically there's some sort of machine, either a crane that drops them from above, or a trap door in the floor that suddenly brings them onto the stage from below. Okay, so it's kind of this appearance of the gods on the stage, and it offers a plot twist that resolve. So basically, there's an unresolvable plot situation, and then the gods appear, or a god appears, out of nowhere, again out of this machine, this trap door or this crane, and so the gods solve the problem. Solve this unsolvable problem. Okay, so we viewers were in a heightened sense of suspense about how the characters would get out of this impossible situation, and then to our relief, the God character appears out of nowhere and fixes it. Okay, so this is, right here at the altar is literally a Deus ex machina situation. But it's not just a plot device to end the scene with relief for both the characters, Abraham and Isaac, and for us. This scene actually delivers the central part of the whole story, of not just of this episode, but the whole point, the central point of the entire Abraham story is delivered here by the God character that appears at the very last moment to solve the problem, to prevent the murder. Okay, and it's a lesson to us and to Abraham. I mean, to us, the audience, and to Abraham, the actor in the play. It's a lesson about God. Okay, so for us today, of course, human sacrifice seems monstrous and unjust. Okay, this is exactly why many of us see this last scene as, with the angel preventing the murder. A lot of some scholars from within the context of biblical criticism say that this last scene is an add-on, that it's contrived, and that it's an unconvincing solution to a serious problem we see in God's cruel and capricious demand for child sacrifice. Okay, so they see it as some sort of a not convincing solution to what seems to them obvious, that God is like other gods of that region and era, that he demands child sacrifice. Okay, and that this is just some sort of later fix to pretty it up. Okay, but again, they see it this way because for all of us today, child sacrifice is monstrous. Okay? But again, in Abraham's world, and in the Israel, so in Abraham's world in, let's say, 1800 or whenever it's supposed to have happened, and in the Israelites' world in, let's say, 1000 BC or so, human sacrifice was common. Okay? It might even have been ubiquitous. We know it was common. We don't know if everyone else in the region did it. The Bible describes the Canaanites as monstrous, partly because of them sacrificing children to their gods. So just as God learns the depth of Abraham's trust in him, so Abraham learns kind of final lesson of how worthy God is of such trust. Because Abraham learns here that God is a just and good God. He does not need or want child sacrifice, unlike these other gods of the ancient Near East. Okay, so the tension is resolved, the child lives, the father is not a murderer, God is not a cruel child sacrificing God, and then God completes that seventh conversation with Abraham by blessing Abraham again with that everything that he had promised him before. And again, he reiterates that promise about, again, everything, including being a blessing to the families of the earth. And then Abraham and Isaac walk down the mountain back home to Sarah.
Is it clear whether Abraham and Isaac walked together home, or because at this point we never see Abraham and Isaac together again?
We never see them together again. We never hear them speaking again. You're right. So I want to talk about this when we talk about Isaac next week. So when you read next week's reading, so next week we're going to read the chapters about Hagar to finish that up, and then about Isaac and Rebekah, Isaac and Jacob. So when you read about Hagar, I want you to think about where Sarah is in all of this, in this story in the Mount Moriah story, in this last episode with Abraham and Isaac. Just see if you can find any clues next week about her role in the sacrifice scene. Okay. So, just to finish off the Abraham-God relationship, I want to go back to those two linked scenes of lekh. Okay? The first conversation, the first demand, leave your home, the last demand. So again, you go, lekh, and cut yourself off from your past, your homeland, your father's house, your family, your patrimony, your protection, your honor, your possessions, and you go to where I tell you. Okay? And then the second one, or the last one, you go to where I tell you and cut yourself off from your future. Okay? Your son, your only son, the son that you love, the son who is the only path to you getting what I promised you. Again, mighty people, etc., etc. Okay? So in both cases, God does not explain why he wants Abraham to do these things. Yeah. For what purpose? God offers no answer to this. This is the obvious question that clearly distresses and perplexes Abraham. Okay? Now, we can understand. So we can understand why Abraham complies with the last demand. Yeah, because he's learned over the past 30 or 40 years to trust God. Again, trust in God's benevolence and care and judgment. Trust God more than he trusts himself. Trust God's wisdom more than his own wisdom. God's morality more than his own morality. Okay, so we can understand, perhaps, some of us more than others, but the point is that you can make an argument explaining why Abraham complies without question and without argument, despite not understanding why Isaac has to die. But given the fact that these two scenes are connected, if we can understand why Abraham complies with the last demand, it brings up the question, why did he comply with the first demand? Before he had learned anything about this God that's speaking to him. Before he could know that this really is God. Before he knew that he was a good God and a caring God, etc., etc. Okay, what made him leave his family and travel to some place that this voice told him before even knowing the destination? Can you make sense of it?
The only thing I can think of is that there was something unsatisfactory about where he came from, and he wanted more of something. He had hope for something more.
In which case, he didn't even need God to tell him to go. He wanted to go anyways.
Unless,
I mean, it's not from what you're saying that there was it's Abraham. There were some force pushing Abraham to go rather than God pulling him to go.
I guess, it could be that God put hope of something more in him.
Yeah. Which of these lekhahs, which of Abraham's responses is the greater act of faith and devotion and submission? Is
I think the
first
first
one or the last one?
The first one.
Why?
Well, I just think so because there was no reason to go, and you're sacrificing so much by leaving your ancestor, like leaving all of that security and everything behind you, and going into something completely unknown without any evidence that anything
Right.
that
Yeah.
seems to be the bigger act, as opposed to after. But I don't know. But still, he's at.
Yeah, it seems that again, if the act of faith, if the leap of faith is, again, jumping off that bridge to your apparent death,
Seemed like he did that his first from the get-go.
exactly. It seems that the first one, it seems to me, look, at least the last one, you can understand that this is not a leap of faith.
Right.
Because he knows to his satisfaction that when he jumps off that bridge, the God of the universe will catch him, because he has a relationship with God. He knows for a fact that God is God, and that God is caring for him and is minding the store and everything, taking care of him. Okay, so it does, again, I'm with you on this, that it seems that the real act of devotion, that Abraham's reputation as being devout, is, as amazing as that last scene is at the altar, at Isaac's altar, that can make rational sense if you know that God is God and God wants this done and God is good and everything else. Then look, who am I to put my moral sense above God's moral sense, if you know that God is God and God wants this? Okay. But in the first one, in the first lekhah, he doesn't know anything about this God. God hasn't proven himself to be good or caring or capable or powerful or anything, or even real.
Yeah, or anything other than he has something in his head.
Yeah. So it seems like the real, again, obviously leaving your father's home is not as momentous as killing your son with your own hands. But at least that last one, you're doing it for God himself. Because God wants it, and God is obviously greater than all of us in terms of moral wisdom, etc., moral judgment. The first one, that is a true leap of faith for reasons that we don't understand, and I don't know if Abraham understands either. So that's, I mean, it's a real question, which is where Abraham gains his reputation as being the most devout man in the Bible. Does he gain it in the first act he commits, or in the last act he commits? In any case, look, we've covered a lot today, so we'll leave it at that, and come back to Hagar, and then race through to Isaac and Rebecca, Isaac and his the woman that he was condemned to marry.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Some of us are more lucky than others in the spouses we wind up with.
All
right.
Look forward to it.
You too. See you next week.
See you next week. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye.